I want to talk about the conscious side of visual perception and then the neuroscience behind it. So most of you are probably familiar with the overall framework that we use to think about and talk about visual perception and the neural basis of it. So obviously there's a lot of physics involved. So we start with photons that originate from fusion at the sun. They travel for several minutes until they hit the surface of the Earth. There they bounce off various objects, and eventually these photons can be accumulated thanks to a crystalline lens that we have in front of our eyes on the retina. And we get this upside-down mirror image of what might be out there in the world. Now, there's already a lot of simplification here. You can see that this tree is green. Obviously, there is no green light. There are only different wavelengths. So in a way, you could think of the images at the back of your eye as a grayscale image. And then you might have already learned a lot about what happens at the back of the eye. So obviously there's phototransduction. So you have some chemistry involved that changes photonic energy into electric energy. And that electric energy is basically action potentials. Those action potentials leave the eye and then make it all the way to the brain. And this is where people usually think things get interesting. So the information, the action potentials, these electric impulses from the eye, they get relayed more or less from the midbrain, the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, towards the primary visual cortex, all the way in the back of your brain. And then you probably learned that this information doesn't stay there. So there are neurons in the primary visual cortex, and they get excited from these action potentials that arrive from the eye via the lateral geniculate nucleus. And their excitation then evokes activity within V1, the primary visual cortex, as well as other areas. So V2 is the secondary visual cortex, V3, the third one, V4, and so on. The idea is that we have the information travel from the back of the brain towards the front of the brain. And people have worked out, with Nobel Prizes involved, that we can look at what these neurons are responding to. What we can measure, what we can observe, is that these neurons in V1, they respond primarily to edges. And then as we move forward, what these neurons are responding to becomes more and more complex. So this is not what I want to talk about today. A lot of this, what I just described, also happens when we put you under deep anesthesia and there's no consciousness whatsoever. All of this still goes on. So this is not what allows you to have consciousness. Now, first I have to define what I mean by consciousness. And the easiest is to demonstrate you what I mean. So this is one of my favorite visual illusions. It's called motion-induced blindness. You can experience it by keeping your eye on one of these red dots, for example, the one here in the lower part. And if you keep your eyes steady and don't move them, but you try to keep track of these other red dots that are also on the display, what you might experience is that they disappear. So you see this red dot that you're looking at. You probably also see the swirly cloud of motion around it. But the other red dots, they come on and off and on and off and on and off. And you can pick each one of those. Obviously, I'm not messing with you. Your brain is messing with you. So this leads to an interesting dissociation, where obviously the world doesn't change. Your consciousness is what changes. You're either aware of the stimulus or you're not. Now, that means that everything that I just showed you must lead somehow, maybe at the tippy top or somewhere in between, to what we call awareness or consciousness. And for the longest time, this was seen as an unscientific question. And the reason for that was that it was seen as something unstudyable. We can do what I just said, look at what these neurons are doing, show stimuli, and show how they react. But this seems to be difficult to answer how neurons relate to you seeing this stimulus, yes or no. Now, people in the 1990s, in particular, one of the co-discoverers of the double helix structure of DNA, Francis Crick, together with Christoph Koch, who's a neuroscientist that is very much still with us today, suggested, yes, it is science, and they proposed a scientific question. And you can see that at that point, Francis already had gotten the Nobel Prize, was very famous. But nonetheless, when they proposed this question, they were able to place this paper with a question mark in the title, just a question, in Nature. It shows you how breakthrough that was. And the question was, where do we find these neurons that seem to correlate with your consciousness? That seems to be a very tractable scientific question. And as I will say later, the idea was once we find where they are, we can look at what they are and maybe find out how this works. Very intriguing. So, as I said, back in the 1990s, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, and others I should mention, they said we should look where the brain represents your perception rather than the stimulus. Now, I threw in here illusory because I just showed you that illusions allow us to decouple the sensory stimulus that we show you, the physical stimulus, from the inner movie that is your consciousness. So the idea was, why don't we use these illusions and just see when you see the stimulus and you don't, where in your brain we find these neurons. So we can find cortical areas, individual neurons, and then we can correlate them with conscious perception. So to make this even more clear, here's this illusion again, motion-induced blindness. And the idea is that we have a constant stimulus as a function of time. Nothing changes in the world. But your perception, as I said, it goes on and off, and on and off, and on and off. It's actually completely random. And the idea was, okay, let's do fMRI, let's put in electrodes and find single neurons. These neurons, they either are unchanging. Those are the truth teller neurons. These neurons, they tell you what the world is really like, which is unchanging. The stimulus is always there. Those are the neurons in your eye, maybe the primary visual cortex. But what we were really interested in were these neurons that go up and down and up and down and up and down in lockstep with what you actually see. These neurons I will call mind reader neurons. Because if you find this neuron and you see it goes on and off and on and off, I do not even have to ask you what you see. I know what you see. These neurons go up and down with what you see. I can read your mind just by looking at these neurons. Now, I have to show you that this works. And in fact, I will only give you 2 slides on this because there is hundreds, if even thousands of studies that have done that. I will show you one of my studies because that's the one I know most about. And then I will tell you that as intriguing as this maybe sounds to you right now, and as convincing, there's a flaw here. And it cost almost this entire work to arrest. So let me get there. This right here is a brain using fMRI. I used this exact illusion. So what we did is we mapped where the red stimulus is. And if you know a little bit about cortical architecture and the primary visual cortex, you probably know that something that is close to where you look at is actually pretty largely represented on the surface of the brain. And it should be roughly round, and it should be very much at the back of your brain. So this right here, what you're looking at, this fMRI activation, is activation to the stimulus. All I had to do now is run the illusion and see when the stimulus is visible or invisible in consciousness and ask what does the fMRI do. And then we could also place electrodes there and measure what the neurons are doing. And again, long story short, I'm not going to go too much into this. This is exactly what we did. You see some controls here. This is where we physically removed the stimulus. This is where it was on the screen, but it was visible. And then here you have this condition where it was invisible. And again, without going too much into details, we found something really striking. If you ask this question, is the primary visual cortex linked or correlated with your perception? The answer is depends on what signal you look at. And this has not been resolved so far. It's a caveat for those of us that do fMRI that these signals can uncouple. And it was one of the first studies that showed that many, many people have shown that since. But that's irrelevant. All I wanted to show you is that we can do this. Now, if you're not convinced by this now, I want to give you briefly, as I said, 2 or 3 more slides. So this is work from Rafi Malach and Itzhak Fried. Rafi is a neuroscientist and Itzhak is a neurosurgeon. And what you see right here is an MRI, and that black shadow is an electrode that was inserted into the brain. The reason for that is that this was a patient with very severe epilepsy. Now, usually we can treat epilepsy by giving people drugs, and we can manage the epilepsy. Sometimes people have it so badly that they still have epilepsy. And you can imagine how dangerous this is. So imagine you're driving in traffic and somebody has a seizure and hits the gas pedal and bumps into your car. This is dangerous. People just losing their consciousness randomly. So what we'll do is we actually go into the brain, neurosurgeons do, and they cut out the part of the brain that is causing the epilepsy. Now, you don't want to cut out a lot of the brain. So what you want to do is only cut out the part of the brain that is diseased. And in order to find out, they put in these electrodes, and then they wait for a seizure to happen. Then they can find out which part of the electrode the seizure came from, and they know that's the part we should cut out. The rest we leave in. Now, this means that these people, they get first one surgery, they get the electrode in their brain, and now they sit in the hospital, and we have to wait until a seizure happens. We can speed it along a little bit. We know that sleep deprivation, for example, causes seizures to happen, so we deprive them of their sleep. Imagine how bored you must be if you sit there and sit there and sit there and you wait for your seizure so then they can do another surgery and cut your brain. So they got approval from ethics boards that they can do scientific experiments while these people are waiting. And so I will show you next a little movie from one of these experiments. And what you will hear is one of these neurons that was recorded in that human as they're watching a movie. So you might have noticed that there were several movie fragments. One was from the movie Titanic, one was the famous speech by Dr. King, but it was The Simpsons. When they came on, that neuron became really active. And then we showed them an NBA scene and the neuron was silent again. So your conclusion may be that we found a Simpson neuron. We found a neuron that seems to be linked somehow to The Simpsons. But we have to test it. We can just ask the person, what did you just see? And I will show you this next. Now, the voice of the patient is distorted, but I also show you closed captions. Now, if you paid very close attention, you might have noticed that the neuron responded before the person said The Simpsons. That's why I call these mind reader neurons. Of course, if you have in your inner eye see The Simpsons, it's going to take a moment until you recognize The Simpsons and you say it's The Simpsons. You can literally hear the mind working here before the person makes any statement. So this idea of Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, that we can find neural activity that co-varies with conscious content, turned out to be easy. Now, as a scientist, at this point, you might say correlation isn't causation. And what we're ultimately interested in is the causation. And for causation, I have to change things. So let me show you this one. This one is a patient exactly as I just described, except this patient was okay with being de-anonymized. So what we're doing in this patient, you cannot see the electrodes, but believe me, they're there. And so what we'll do in this patient is we're not going to just listen to the electrodes. We will now run a current into that electrode and tickle these neurons to get active.
Just look at my face and tell me what happens when I do this, all right? 1, 2, 3.
Nothing.
Nothing?
It was a controller.
I'm going to do it one more time. Look at my face. 1, 2, 3.
You just turned into somebody else.
Tell me
Your
about it.
face metamorphosed.
So obviously, if these neurons have some close relationship to consciousness, and we change what they do, it should change your consciousness. We can extend then this paradigm from neural activity that co-varies to neural activity that determines to some degree conscious constant. But then this happened. What are we going to do now? I told you before that the hope was that once we find these neurons, we find where they are, we might learn something about what they do, how this works. All we still have is this. These neurons do something and then your consciousness changes. So gradually, the field began to realize that we ran into a wall. This is it. We found these neurons that correlate, have even some impact, but we still don't know what consciousness is, how the brain does it, and so on. To make things worse, the very same neurons sometimes are correlated with your consciousness and sometimes don't. So the circuitry, the proteome, the genome, none of that can really be decisive. So that is even more frustrating. And as a consequence, I will show you next, if you plot the number of publications on PubMed that use neural correlates of consciousness, this paradigm, as I told you, it peaked in the 1990s and has been on steady decline ever since. We're stuck. Now, for the rest of your talk, I want to show you what happened 3 or 4 years ago that changed my mind entirely. And I think we're not stuck. But that will actually go very deep. And as I said, it might provoke, maybe in the end, quite a bit of discussion, because there's some heterodox views involved about what science actually is. So the first point I want to make is that the, again, original idea was that we find some kind of neural activity processes, and we find out how this relates to a conscious state. Now, I think the first unspoken problem in all of that is that while we called it correlates, there was always this implication that there must be some kind of causal connection. That when these neurons do this, and I always have a change in conscious constant, it is causing this to change. And the second unspoken assumption here, and this will cut deep now, is that we as neuroscientists often are satisfied with this. This is what people call a mechanistic model, where we have a cause, an arrow, and an effect. Now, if you think about how many models you've seen in neuroscience that are boxes with arrows, you realize what I'm talking about. I think that this comes from a time more than 100 years ago where science in general thought this way. So what am I talking about? So I'm going to introduce you to an idea by a philosopher called James Ladyman. And he came up with this term, microbangings. That's because he's critiquing the view that a lot of us, including scientists, these days hold. That if you look at what the world is made out of, our bodies, our proteins, the carbon inside of it, the table, what people think it's these tiny ping pong balls that cannot be divided any further. The whole idea is that we're living in a clockwork universe where you have these little ping pong balls, protons, neutrons, electrons, and they bump into each other. And just like on a pool table, when they bump into each other, they cause the other ones to move. You can explain temperature this way. Boltzmann's law about gas particles, the hotter it gets, the more they bump around. This made a lot of sense until Albert Einstein started quantum physics. And then later on, pulled out the rug even more with special and then general relativity. But in high school, we're not taught that. In high school, most of us learn Newtonian physics, F equals ma. We might learn Maxwell's equations because it turns out they could still be explained in Newtonian physics. As long as you believe in the ether. Because the ether was supposed to be these little particles everywhere that when your phone talks to an antenna over there, they're physically linked by tiny ping pong balls. There is no ether. The guy who tried to find the ether spent 6 or 7 years on it. Couldn't find it. But he wanted to. Even when he died, and everybody else thought, great job, you showed there is no ether, he was unhappy. He thought he had done a poor experiment. So now you can see that what James Ladyman is critiquing, that there are microbangings, is a naive kind of physicalism. Science actually doesn't believe in this anymore. Let me expand on this a little bit. So this, most of you have seen at some point, is a magnetic field. The field itself is not observable. It's inferred. We assume it's there because we can see its effect. Now, of course, the field itself, when you ask, well, what is it then? Well, imagine each location in space, we have a number. And that number tells the iron particles how to orient. And what we did right there is we took a major step. And so I'm quoting here from a book that was written, an excellent book, about that time in history and scientific history. He was the first to recognize that the foundations of the physical world are imperceptible to our senses. All we know about them, possibly all we can ever know, are their mathematical relationships. Maxwell had not only dispensed with the need for a mechanical model, a mechanism, but he had gone further. So one problem with that in neuroscience and psychology is the following. The whole idea that we can look at behavior of an organism and then we think that that tells us something about consciousness, possibly. But then I'm going to borrow this quote from Jolie Tononi. What something is far more than what something does. In fact, What you do is a consequence of you being. You first have to be before you can do something. So this is a confusion, to look at what something does and then to infer what something is. Because consciousness, I'm going to argue, is not something that you do. You don't do conscious. You are conscious. It's a state of existence. And people have realized this long before we did AI and these debates became online. If an AI behaves like it's conscious, is it conscious, yes or no? So I'm going to go all the way back here to the 1800s. A very famous opera by Offenbach, where he talks about Hoffman's tale. It's a romantic author, E.T.A. Hoffman, falling in love with what we now would call an android, a machine. Something that works only mechanistically, but it functions like a human being. And eventually the machine breaks down. And this is what's interesting. The protagonist is disappointed. Because it seems that if we fall in love with an AI, even though it's a perfect illusion of a human being, but we learn that it's not conscious, it seems that we're unsatisfied that the thing we love did never really love us back. We understand that there's a difference between behavior and consciousness. And if you're not convinced, because I know among academics, there are people that are claiming that once an AI is behaving like a human being, it is conscious. Most people don't. And I came with proof. This here is from an old NPR website, and they wrote about the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Robots. That was a good idea, because if an AI is as conscious as you are, we should not turn it off. That's a death penalty, isn't it? We should also not be cruel and torture it. The ethics that we afford to each other, we should afford to another conscious being. Nobody believes that. This website has long been shut down. Now that we have AI that works this way. And so I'm going to use here this figure from Christoph Koch, who founded this field. And in one of his latest books, he has this graph that I think shows it very succinctly. We've been duped into this because if we look at biological organisms, there tends to be a correlation with how much we attribute consciousness and how much we attribute intelligence. But what we find with ChatGPT and all of these AIs is that they're probably not conscious. That what they probably are just what people call stochastic parrots. Very high intelligence, all right, but probably no consciousness. Of course, you can also think of cases where maybe you have a lot of high consciousness and no intelligence. So some people might say only humans have it. Some people would say my dog clearly is also conscious. But then what about a fungus or an amoeba? So either you believe that there's a gradient or you believe there's a minimal amount of consciousness. So if you learn physics, for example, you learn that there seems to be a minimal amount of time and a minimal amount of space. Those minimal amounts of space and time we call Planck units. So if there's minimal units for space and time, maybe there's a minimal unit for consciousness as well, for example. And then one of these might cross that threshold. Of course, I wouldn't be very conscious, but there's some kind of consciousness. Okay, so I'm aware that this was maybe heterodox. So I'm claiming that I'm deriving you of function, behavior, and computation, because I just argued that's more of the same. I will go into that in a moment. It seems that we cannot talk about things mechanistically anymore. But then it seems like we lost science altogether. I'm going to argue that that's the exact opposite of what's really true. Because if you really look into science, deep down what we know is this. I already mentioned quantum physics, thermodynamics with Boltzmann, Newtonian laws, Maxwellian equations, Einsteinian relativity. These equations describe the entire universe. Black holes, laser pointers, quantum computers, how airplanes fly, how your iPhone works. Now, I want to point your attention to the fact that these are equations. All of them are equations. And yet, it explains everything. That is really remarkable. This might be actually one of the deepest philosophical questions that we're still facing in our lifetime. How can it be that mathematics, something that we come up with in our armchair, is describing black holes and allowing us to fly airplanes? Now, at this point, sometimes I get pushback and people say that's because it is humans doing this and it's a language just as I'm using right now. Math is a language. Not so. So we can do fMRI studies and we can look at how your brain processes mathematics versus language, completely different areas. It's not just the language. Another pushback I often get is that people have heard this, all models are wrong. Might be true for statistical models. It's not true for all models. To make it more concrete, how do we know that 1 meter is 1 meter? Well, it was because people at some point took a piece of metal, they cut it into a shape and said, that's 1 meter. Guess what it's called? A meter. And we still have it in Paris. And the whole rest of the world had to go there and measure what 1 meter is and then go back home with this thing and said, folks, that's a meter. Now, that is a model of a meter. Is it wrong? Clearly not. This is correct. Now, tied all the way back to consciousness. I'm going to argue we can do the exact same thing. Rather than trying to find mechanistic micro-banging models between what the neurons are doing and your conscious perception, we have to do mathematics. You already assume that there are certain states of your brain, parts of activity in certain parts that are you, that are your consciousness. There is an equal sign implied already. So we have to change that mechanistic model into equations. Now, at this point, again, a lot of people push back and say, well, I agree with you that we can reduce these complex things simpler down into science. But I believe it's computation, not mathematics. Right here, you see a computation. And I laid it out with Mars 3 levels, which some of you might be familiar with. That's the implementation of the computation, the algorithm itself, and then finally the computation, meaning the telos, the goal of the computation. Mars said, this is how we ultimately understand the brain. The computation I'm showing you right here is a little bit complicated. It's Grover's algorithm. I took it because it lends itself easily to explain what I mean. Grover's algorithm is one of the algorithms that might change our world because they work on a quantum computer. This is a quantum computer. We can already build them. So the implementation is a quantum computer. This right here is how programming languages look like if you work with quantum computers. They're nicely graphical. And then I'd already told you there's an ultimate goal. And so Grover's algorithm is actually just a search through a library. So we have everything. We have the computation, the algorithm, and the implementation. But all of this is actually just this very simple equation. That is Grover's algorithm in Dirac notation. So I'm going to steal the quote that nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. And I'm going to argue that nothing makes sense in science except in the light of mathematics. In physics, that is widely appreciated. If I give this talk with a physics audience, everybody nods. But the neuroscience of consciousness is difficult because, yes, we have a lot of models, but only one of them is fully mathematically formalized. Because of that, not because of favoritism, for the rest of this talk, I will talk about this theory. Now, I want to show you the math of this theory. It's right here. It's about 22 equations. And usually when people see this mathematics, they find that maybe this is a little much. And I think that's a good point. 22 equations is a lot of mathematics, and as good scientists, we learn, Occam's razor, that we should keep things simple, and if you have multiple theories, the simple theory should win. So I'm gonna now have to prove to you why you need all of these 22 equations. First, these 22 equations explain, without me explaining you the slide, how vision feels differently from hearing. Vision feels like there's a painting right in front of you. That's not hearing at all. We have to explain that by the theory, and it does. More so, the theory told us that go in the brain and look for the following thing. Measure the activity of the brain with EEG, just put some EEG electrodes on it to see the voltages, and then take a TMS, a transmagnetic pulse, activate a part of the brain with a focal EMF pulse, and then see how it spreads. If the person is conscious, it should spread differently than if the person is unconscious. Long story short, you're not conscious during non-REM sleep, dreamless sleep. You're not conscious doing deep general anesthesia. You are conscious when you are awake. You are conscious when you suffered a stroke, most of the time. You are conscious during REM sleep or dream sleep. And you are conscious when you take ketamine. You just don't seem conscious. It's a very interesting drug. And look at this. Just as the theory predicted, the brain responds. We did not know that. The theory said, go and look, and people did. And in fact, this has been just recently translated into the clinic. So this is a video of a clinic in Italy where one of the scientists who's working on that is doing what I just said. That's a TMS device. That's an EEG cap. And they're measuring the brain responses of a patient that seems to be in a coma. And they're looking at, is this patient conscious, yes or no? Because I just told you before that if you just look at behavior, it's not enough. Somebody might not respond to you because they don't want to or cannot do. And then you think this person is unconscious. So this theory, not only does it give us mathematics, but not only did it have these correct predictions, not only does it explain to us already things about our psychology. So let me tell you what this theory is without going too much into the math. This theory, as I said, is called integrated information theory, and it was devised by Professor Jolie Tononi, and many people have worked in the meantime on this theory. If you're interested, there's an excellent website, a wiki, where everything is going to show in much more detail. But it does require you to rethink about science, and I already hope I got you part of the way. There's another part that is very important, which is that because of this clockwork universe, Newtonian physics worldview that I started to critique, I think that this is how a lot of neuroscientists think about the brain and perception. They think that there's a real world out there. And so Kant used this fancy word, noumena. It's a mind-independent world. And then there is what we call the phenomena or the phenomenal world. Now, I already told you, when we see a tree, we don't see the individual photons that are radiating off it. We just make up the color green in our heads. So there's this divide between those two. Now, importantly, what this suggests is that this is something we're certain of, and this is something we're not that certain of. There are some people that even say, because this is what we're so certain of, and it's difficult to derive from the photons and the protons and the neutrons how your consciousness works, maybe this doesn't even exist. These are people are called illusionists, and they think that you're not really conscious, you're just making this up. Now, I'm going to argue that it's exactly the other way around. So when in science we talk about objectivity or the third-person perspective, I came to think one day, what is this? I've never seen the third-person perspective. I only know my first-person perspective. And I can think about how you see the world from a very similar first-person perspective. But we have never seen a third-person perspective, have we? You only have the first-person perspective. We assume that there's a third-person perspective. And then we pretend that science operates in this third-person perspective. But our access is always from a first person. So I'm going to say that this is unquestionably real. You exist. You are conscious. Everything else is uncertain. Of course, this goes back to René Descartes. I should give credit where credit's due, who, by the way, got this from St. Augustine, realizing that I think, therefore I must exist. And everything else has to be established from there. So I'm going to turn your epistemic certainty about what you know and what you don't know exactly around from you know that there is radioactivity out there, and you're not so sure about your conscious state. I'm going to argue that you know you exist, and you're not so sure about radioactivity. Why is this important? This is important because the theory, even though it's based on mathematics, is, as is good mathematics, based on a few assumptions, 5, and we can't prove these assumptions. So we have to start with some point where we say that is plausible. And I'm showing you these. In mathematics, assumptions that cannot be proven, but all of mathematics is built off, are called axioms. You probably heard of Euclid's axioms and how all of geometry is based on them. Or you might have heard that all of mathematics is based on set theory, and it's based on roughly 10 assumptions or axioms. And then people sometimes bicker about this or that axiom. Now, the same is true here. So we have a serial axiom, and that is that you exist. That's such a trivial assumption, but it has to be spelled out. And then we have that consciousness is intrinsic, it's information, it's integrated, you hear and see at the same time, it's exclusive. You do not see a pink elephant in front of you right now, and you do not see what's behind of you. And it's compositional. Things that are over there, and they don't float around. It's highly structured and all that. And once we have these axioms, we can march towards mathematics, where we take each of these axioms and then we construct postulates. What's a postulate? This is a little bit of a unique way that IIT uses this term. But it's saying I'm going to accept all of these axioms, And now I'm going to think, if there is a brain, how would it have to function for these axioms to be true? So for example, if something exists, what I have to find is that there has to be some causality in it. Because something that exists in the universe and doesn't interact with the entire rest of the universe, no causal effect on anything, we wouldn't even know that it exists. For us to know existence, it has to have an effect. And then I can formalize what an effect is in mathematics. And so I invite you to go to the wiki and you can learn about the mathematics. You can also go to Google Colab, where the good people in Julia Tononi's lab translated that mathematics into Python code. And you can run this mathematics on your very own data. That's the last part of this talk I'm going to show you. So this is on GitHub, the toolbox that uses this mathematics and runs the code. Why is this interesting? So this was the first study that caught my attention. This was neural recordings in Drosophila, in a fruit fly, in a mushroom body, which is, I guess, the most closest brain-related thing we can find. They took the local field potentials, the electric voltages from these fruit flies, when they were either awake or put into a cylinder with a gas anesthesia in it. And turns out fruit flies, they seem to fall asleep. They stop moving. And then they compute with this mathematics just one number out of this mathematics. And you can see that when the fruit flies are awake or when they are asleep, that number differs exactly as the theory predicts. I was intrigued by that. I got my postdoc, Jake Westerberg, to do the very same thing. And I'm not going to bore you with the details. So these are laminar recordings, neuropixel-like things. Important thing is this. We looked at this value. You can see the neural response right here. And there's nothing happening on the screen. Something comes on, the number goes up. Tense, number goes really up. A tense away might fall out of the conscious focus, and the number goes down a lot. Maybe we're just getting lucky. Let's keep going. So this is Katie Chang, another professor here at Vanderbilt. She does fMRI. And she's interested in when people fall asleep inside the fMRI machine. Because those of you who know fMRI, that, of course, is bad. Not just because these people don't do the task you want to do, but also because the brain goes up and down a lot in activity when people fall asleep. So she had this really great idea to come up with a machine learning algorithm that takes input from an EEG that people have inside the MRI machine, look at how alert they are, and then try to regress this out of the fMRI signal to clean it up. Long story short, that mathematics I just told you works better. Then we just looked at EEG. And so this is an interesting EEG trace. Again, gonna tell you all about the details. This is a spectrogram, so you can see low frequencies, high frequencies as a function of time. And if you're familiar with how sleep works, it's that the high frequencies go down and the low frequencies go up. Attention, same thing. So what we see, this in black are the low frequencies, in blue the high, the gamma frequencies. You can see there's this transition where this person clearly fell asleep. And again, we do the math, pulls it out right exactly. Then we use neuropixel recordings that are publicly available. These are 2 graduate students and an undergraduate student in my lab. And we computed this measure from neuropixels recording in a mouse to flashes, static rating, Gabor stimuli, natural scenes, and movies. So these stimuli are gradually becoming more complex, and that value keeps going up. Lastly, I'm currently working with teams on data from C. elegans. And so this is this microscopic worm that's transparent. And it's interesting because we know all of the connections of all of these neurons. It doesn't have that many. It has about 1,033 and then 400 something in its brain. We can hold the worm tight. And then because it's transparent, we can look at all of these neurons. We label them optogenetically, and we see the activity of each neuron, train a machine learning algorithm. And I know which neuron is active at what time and what it does to its neighbors. The downside, of course, it's a worm. And long story short, again, the theory holds. So what we're able to pull out without going into details is exactly as you expect. And we can now even study what the neural mechanisms are. Again, not going to go too much into details, also very much ongoing work. Now, this is the long story short of my talk. When I started, I told you that we're interested, obviously as scientists, how this works. That we believe there are things out there in the world. We're not quite as sure, but we believe. And then they cause this whole chain reaction of neural activity. And then somehow, in the end, you become conscious of that. And most of the time, what we do in neuroscience is we map this relationship of a stimulus to a neural response. That's what most systems neuroscientists are doing. In psychology, people have already tried to map stimuli directly to perception. It's a process called psychophysics. But what we're really interested in is what the inventors of psychophysics called inner psychophysics. What we're interested in is this relationship. How does neuronal activity relate to your conscious perception? And I've been arguing the whole time that this should be mathematical, not boxes and arrows. And I showed you that we already have that. So we have integrated information theory, and it gives us these mathematical equations, 22 in all. But I showed you how you can just use the Python code. You do not have to know the equations. You can just run it, and you can do this mapping. Now, do I believe that that's it? Of course not. That's the first theory that we have. What I'm trying to do is to encourage people to do more. Poke holes into this theory. See what we can improve. Come up with your own mathematical theory. And maybe even start thinking this way for your own research that's not about consciousness. Think about what the final goal of your work is. What you want to find out as a neuroscientist. Whether it's boxes and arrows or laws of nature, equations, as we have in physics. And so with that I will finish. I will argue that this is an old joke that when it comes to the brain-consciousness relationship, science for the longest time was embarrassed, and it just came up with this, it just happens, a miracle occurs. And of course the joke is, I think you have to be a little bit more rigorous about this. And the rest of science doesn't have this problem. And we might be getting there for the science of consciousness as well. So with that, thank you very much all, and I'm open for questions.